Welcome, welcome, welcome. Good morning, good morning. And we are starting both of our broadcasts now. We are now live. Good morning. We are now live on YouTube live stream at Church Love 333. This is where I keep my archive of these teachings and videos. So if you want to, if for whatever reason you can't get to them here by Periscope, I do have a different viewpoint as I'm reading from the live stream on YouTube, but you can go there, and the playlist is Reflections on Race. There's also another playlist of our archive of all of the readings we did on MLK, and that playlist is MLK Uncut. So if you ever want to go back and check out those reflections on race, those readings, they are logged there. So good morning to you all. And let's see what just happened here with my live Google Hangout. There we go. All right. So good morning. I hope that everybody is doing well. I hope that everybody is having what I like to call a motivational Monday. We are back with our reflections on race. And we have been reading from Tim Wise's book called White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. And Tim Wise is an anti-racism activist. He's been at it now for probably about maybe 20, 25 years, standing in the gap and really going to bat for people of color on the issues of employment, education, housing, criminal justice, and other different issues. This is Tim White's own story about his life, about what it means to be white in America, what it means to live under the title of whiteness in America. He is, I believe, Irish and Jewish, but as we know, in America, the title whiteness covers a whole gamut of people: Irish, Italian, Jewish, Russian, even some East Africans are labeled under the title of whiteness in America, in case you didn't know. So he talks about, in this book, he's talking about what it is like to go through life with privilege, knowing that you didn't earn it. And he's really kind of going through and detailing how very different his life is as a white man in America. Unfortunately, we have people who are still in denial of this system, right, of whiteness and white supremacy that allows certain people to have rights and privileges, or certain people to skirt by and get away with things that others probably would not. And so, yeah, that's where we are. He started out talking about going all the way through from his childhood to where his parents were very intentional about putting him in environments with people of color, putting him in a school with predominantly Black children, so that he would not be like so many Americans. I believe the percentage is around 70% of Americans, white Americans, don't even have Black friends. So what does that mean? That means that the only information that they're getting about African Americans, or the only information that they're getting about Black people, is from media. And most of you know how dangerous that is, to judge your opinions of a people group or a person off of media, right? Even if it is the news, it's really biased and it's really skewed. So if that is your only understanding of another people group, is what you've seen on television or what television has shown you, that's going to be a very skewed perspective. So, one of the things that he recommends is, getting in environments, being intentional about making friends with people of color, so that if you see something that is a stereotype, or that is, something that you will know that it's not true. Why? Because you have had your own experience, your own relationships with people of color. So you won't just be going off of what the news is telling you. Okay. So he goes through, he's talking about his preschool experience. He goes to elementary school. He shows in elementary school how the children at that point, from elementary to middle school, they are deliberately being separated out. right? It's not something that they're trying to do, but it is something that the system of schooling has done for them, which is very true. The scheduling of the classes, the scheduling of what kids are going to go into certain upper level classes and the regular classes and the lower level classes and the special ed classes, or the special needs classes as they call them today. So he talks about that, how the black friends that he began to make friends with, even in his neighborhood, that by the time he got to these schools, he didn't see these children during the day. So it began to separate him from the kids that he was getting to know, because they were put on a different track educationally. And this happens quite a bit. As he said, it really had nothing to do with whether or not they could do the work, or it had really very little to do with their intelligence. It was a way, the type of scheduling that was happening was a way of separating the black kids from the white kids. And it's still going on in schools today. So we had a whole conversation about that, making sure that if your child is in a public school or even in a charter school, that you're making sure that the classes that they're giving your child is classes that relate to their academic ability. And if they can't show you that it's in relation to their academic ability, then you need to challenge what kind of courses that your child is being put in. So he goes from middle school, elementary school, to high school. He talks about the fine arts programs. He talks about electives and how some of the electives are definitely geared toward white America. He was talking about if you take certain classes like the drama classes, he was talking about how his instructor would only pick out dramas, right, that fit the white male character as the lead. So if you're a person of color and all your teacher picks out is material that only fits white males as the lead, then where does that leave you in developing your gift? Where does that leave you in developing that skill? Where does that leave you as far as your interest level in being in a class that doesn't even really acknowledge your existence or your talents or put them to use, except to, as he said, make some of the people of color in the class, the people who did the stage set or the people who did the lighting or the people who pulled the curtains, but they weren't really getting the opportunity to show forth their acting skills because why? The curriculum. Okay, so that was another piece that he pointed out. So he takes us through, now he has taken us through his college years, how he got involved in activism, how he recognized in the last thing he got involved in with college with the apartheid movement in South Africa, how he recognized that he got called out on his own levels of ignorance, right? That he was so gung-ho about fighting these issues in South Africa with apartheid that he was not paying attention to his own issues in the community that his college was located in that had the same similar apartheid issues. But hey, because it's America, we don't really call it apartheid, right? We don't really see it as there's still segregation issues happening right now in America. There's still issues with the treatment of Black Americans and the disparity of how they are treated by our law enforcement. So once he got called to the carpet on that, he recognized that there were certain things that he needed to do and things that he needed to change in how he was approaching local issues. Friday, we ended with something very important. We talked about how David Duke is now back in the spotlight again. It is 2016, and this man who was a former Grand Knight of the Ku Klux Klan, how he is in 2016, he is running for office again. And we talked about the fact that Tim White had a hand in helping to defeat him years ago when he tried to run for office the first time. But we began to talk about why is it that he is now popular again? What has made hatred popular again? And we all know that there's one candidate, you know, that has been consistently spewing things about different people groups, whether they be immigrants, whether they be Muslims, whether they be Black Americans, whether they be Mexican Americans. He has consistently emboldened and empowered people who have hate in their hearts against certain people groups. He has consistently empowered them to think that their language, that their behavior, that their rhetoric is okay. And because of that, it has emboldened people who nobody should ever be thinking about electing for public office. It has emboldened them to come back out of the woodworks some 20, 30 years later to run again. Why? Because this person has said that he supports Donald Trump, and that Donald Trump, that this is the best time he believes for him to run again. Now think about that. Why would a Klansman, a former Grand Master or whatever, Grand Chief, whatever you want to call him, Klansman, come back out of the woodwork some 30-something years later to support a candidate and then turn around and say, I believe that now is the best time for me to run again for public office? That should not be so. So Friday, we ended with the fact of what David Duke's former election results were. And as Tim Wise said, 60% of white Louisianans had voted for him. That's not a win. Even though he lost the election, 60% of white Louisianans had voted for Duke. And in some northern Louisiana parishes, the numbers climb closer to 70%. Now listen to what he says. For those of you who don't think your local vote matters. He said, only a high Black voter turnout had prevented David Duke from winning. But even then, in his final tally, he received 43.5% of the overall vote, which sent shockwaves through the state and the nation. As the man, as the campaign person explained that evening to the media who had actually won, he said the election had been a referendum on hate, and hate had won. Because even though David Duke lost the election, 70% of white Americans, 70% of white Americans, many of them who oftentimes say, I don't see color, 70% of them voted for a former Grand Master of the Ku Klux Klan to represent their state nationally. That's a problem. That is a problem. And I'm going to take a sip of my hot coffee here in just a moment. But that's a problem. Think about that. So we're going to continue reading from this point to look at what happens to Tim Wise after he leaves the collegiate scene and after he leaves the campaigning scene, to make sure that David Duke is not elected back then. Having managed to score such a great job right out of school, I was unprepared for the professional insecurity that would follow in the wake of the anti-Duke campaign. Not that I had expected to find jobs as easily as I'd wrangled the one at the coalition, but still, what would transpire over the next several years was the very definition of an occupational roller coaster. For at least 4 weeks after the election, I was still half work, acting essentially as a gopher on the congressional campaign of Mark Morio, who was running against William Jefferson for the House seat, vacated by longtime Congresswoman Lindy Boggs. I had known Mark for 2 years, having met him during the anti-apartheid movement. He was a local civil rights attorney and son of the city's first black mayor, Ernest Dutch Morial, who would become mayor himself in 1994. In this race, however, and despite the clout of his late father's political machine, Mark would lose to Jefferson, the latter of whom would go on to serve nearly 20 years in Congress before being indicted on corruption charges a few years ago, another in a long line of not quite honest Louisiana politicians. My responsibilities in the campaign were essentially banal. I answered phones, went to the post office to mail campaign flyers and other materials, ran errands for supplies, and did whatever else was needed around the office. It was boring, but it was a paycheck, and I'm grateful for the experience, if only because it taught me how much I despise the game of electoral politics. Any thought of working on campaigns for traditional candidates, even those I respected like Mark, went out the window by November 1990. There was no aspect of it that appealed to me. Not the glad handing for money, not the butt kissing for votes, not the pandering to people you didn't even like just to seem electable, and certainly not the gamesmanship which turned such efforts into mere competitions between high-priced consultants who, if they aren't selling politicians, would be hawking get-rich-quick schemes on late-night infomercials or perhaps X-Team tablets. At the same time that I was trying to figure out the direction in which I wanted to go professionally, I had just begun a new relationship with a woman I met during the anti-Duke campaign, but who was, to be sure, not the typical activist type. Nicole Bro was a local born and reared in mostly white suburbs of Jefferson Parish, in other words, David Duke country. Though she didn't live in the district from which Duke had been elected to the State House in 1989, she spent a lot of time there, including at her and soon to be our favorite dive bar, Mix, a pub run by a young Irish-American kid named Rusty and frequented by more than a few of Duke's supporters. Nicole was a student at Tulane, a year behind me, and although her social circle included a lot of whites with less than enlightened racial views, she was militantly opposed to Duke. She would in fact throw a beer on him during a St. Patrick's Day parade a few years later, and was committed to challenging those friends of hers to see what she saw in the Klansmen who was so covetous of and had likely received their votes. Indeed, among the things that attracted me to her had been her fearlessness in standing up to the kinds of white people who, frankly, I had never spent any significant time around. Coming from a liberal left background where I had been able to construct a life that allowed me to avoid too many overtly racist white people, and even working class white folks, period, racist or not, her bravado at telling her mostly male social circle where to step off was fascinating to me. Although we couldn't have been more different, at the time I was wearing tie-dyed t-shirts and a woven bracelet in the colors of the African National Congress, while she coveted Chanel bags and DKNY. There was something about her that I found alluring. Nicole would move in with me at the house on Robert Street, despite how its hippie vibe and condition no doubt offended her fashionista sensibilities. While there, she would put her own mark on the place, lining up a house party performance by an old friend of hers. Now, though famous, was just beginning her career. Varla Merman would perform at a party we all threw for an 18th birthday, she being one of 2 high school seniors who had moved in earlier that year. I feel certain that Varla, who became festooned in a Poochie catsuit and performed for an hour, has never since played in such a dreary environment that was provided for her. Given her now regular appearances in Provincetown, not to mention a stint on Broadway, she has come a long way. For the next several months after the Morial campaign flamed out, I worked off and on for Lance at the coalition offices. Money was still trickling in from contributors, and so occasionally we would have enough cash on hand to hire me back as a research assistant or handle some leftover media interviews about Duke and what we thought he might be up to next. It wouldn't take long to be able to answer that question, as Duke announced that he intended to run for governor of Louisiana in the fall of 1991, the very next year. Round 2 was about to begin. But for me, it may have well been over before it even started, had it not been for Lance's willingness to stand up to at least one coalition board member who sought to have me fired. In November 1990, I penned an article for what would prove to be the next to last edition of my paper, The Avant. Therein, I discussed my personal outrage at the way in which the state of Israel had consistently supported South Africa, all throughout the decades-long struggle against apartheid, the racist regime of South Africa. As an American, I was offended by U.S. support of the white minority regime there, and as a Jew, I was horrified that this government, to which we Jews were expected to have some fond regard, if not outright religious loyalty, would support the oppression of Black South Africans by way of technology transfers, economic investment, and even military involvement with the government there. The essay was scripted in response to an article I had read the previous summer in the Nashville Jewish Federation newsletter. To Korn and the hyper-Zionists who think like him, nothing Israel does in defense of the Jewish state has ever been objectionable. Jews are always innocent, always victims, and never victimizers. And to suggest otherwise is to make one anti-Semite. In Korn's view, Israel shouldn't be criticized for trade and investment with South Africa, since several Arab states also engaged in such activity, a geopolitical equivalent of the old Billy Through the Rocks 2 defense, and about as unconvincing. In the piece, I detailed the various entanglements between the Jewish state and the white racist regime in South Africa, and noted the special irony of such linkages, given the way in which the first 4 apartheid governments had been led by men who were Nazi collaborators during World War II. What self-respecting Jewish person would support connections of this sort by way of their silence just so their precious Israel could avoid a well-deserved rebuke? Apparently, the answer was Jane Buxbaum, the treasurer of the Louisiana Coalition and head of the local Jewish Federation, who decided that my apostasy with regard to Israel was grounds for termination. Upon learning of the article, thanks to the frenetic call of Harley Cars Wagman, the rabbi at the Tulane Hillel House, who fashioned himself quite the liberal, who had seen it within hours of its release, Buxbaum called Lance and said that in her opinion, I should have no further role in the coalition. Blurring the lines between actual anti-Jewish bigots like Duke and anti-Zionist Jews like myself, or merely Jews who didn't think it right to support anti-Black racism in South Africa, Buxbaum and Cars Wagman suggested that I was hardly better than the man whom I'd been working to defeat in the past several months. I learned of Rabbi Harley's outrage while having dinner at Nicole's mom's house. It was there when Shiloh DeWeese, one of the roommates and longtime Avant Collective member, called to inform me of his present temper tantrum. Harley had called the house incensed by the essay and demanded a retraction. Shiloh had asked him what, if anything, about the piece was factually inaccurate, to which he replied, nothing. There was nothing inaccurate about the claims that I had made. Israel had indeed supported South African apartheid, but according to the rabbi, Jews should not write such truths, no matter how accurate. We should not, in Harley's words, air other Jews' dirty laundry. That such lunacy confirmed my decision 9 years before to leave the temple seemed apparent. If this was the orthodoxy required to remain a Jew in good standing, by all means, I thought, then let me be a Jewish man in exile. Lance would have none of it, of course. My views on Israel, which he largely shared, were irrelevant to my work at the coalition, he explained. Not to mention, all of the 300 people might have read the article, and I hadn't identified myself in the byline as working for the coalition. So what difference did it make? Though I received several hostile calls at the Avant House from white-ringed Jewish people who lectured me on my insufficient devotion to our spiritual homeland, the controversy blew over rather quickly. That said, it had demonstrated to me the tenuous nature of anti-racist allyship. All of my life, I had heard that we as Jews were almost inherently predisposed to oppose injustice. Excuse me. The result of our religious teachings and our experiences as targets for oppression and even extermination. But as it turned out, we were just as motivated by power and self-interest as anyone else. Liberal and leftist Jews could turn into apologists for murder and discrimination just as soon as Israel was in the picture, whether regarding South Africa or the Palestinians. Jane and Harley had taught me a lesson all right, but it hadn't been the one they'd set out to impart. What I'd learned was that, politically speaking, we Jews were really just slightly different brand of white folks. Wow. However, it wasn't only the organized Jewish community that could prove inconsistent on being an ally for Black folks. In late spring 1991, funding for the coalition hadn't picked up sufficiently to allow for my full-time rehiring to work on the gubernatorial campaign against David Duke. So worried about finances, but wanting to remain involved in progressive activism, I took a job as a statewide coordinator for Students Organizing Students. This was a New York-based group working to secure reproductive freedom for women, especially in states like Louisiana, where abortion access was constantly being threatened by lawmakers. Although the job was supposed to be for one person, they had approached me about sharing the responsibilities with Annalise Singh. It was too much for her to do alone, she said, and since I still had occasional work at the coalition, a part-time gig would work well for me, so I jumped at the chance. I knew Annalise to be a first-rate organizer and being a staunch supporter of abortion rights and full range of women's reproductive choices. I saw it as an opportunity to make a difference on an issue while gaining critical organizing experience in the process. The timing of my work with SOS could not have been more fortunate, as it dovetailed with David Duke's authorship of a bill in the state that would pay poor women on income support to be temporarily sterilized with Norplant contraceptive inserts, as if the legislature's annual attempts to prohibit or severely curtail abortion access weren't bad enough. Now Duke was offering a limit reproductive freedom in other direction by all but bribing mothers to undergo sterilization so as to limit childbirth. Annalise and I both thought it would be an excellent opportunity to demonstrate the intersection between oppressions, racism, classism, and sexism, since anti-welfare sentiment was obviously aimed at women, and poor women in particular, and poor women of color even more directly. So in addition to organizing against proposed restrictions, we began working against House Bill 1584 as well, the Duke sterilization plan. Now, let me put a caveat here and say unequivocally that abortion, right, is not reproductive freedom. I know people think it is. But abortion is murder. So reproductive freedom is what is being called, but the reality is it's murder. And the fact that David Duke would put forth a sterilization plan to pay poor women on welfare to sterilize themselves to limit their childbirth should tell you a little bit about what abortion is really about. So I'm going to keep reading. During this time, I co-authored along with Lance a report critiquing the Norplant bill for the coalition, which we distributed to lawmakers and the media. Therein, we explained the connections between Duke's plan and his long-standing support for Nazi-like eugenics programs. I'm going to put another plug there. Abortion in and of itself is a eugenics program. For some reason, people do not understand that. But abortion itself is a eugenics program. I'm going to say it one more time. Abortion itself is a eugenics program. It is specifically placed in the neighborhoods. 80% to 85% of the time, these clinics are placed in neighborhoods of color. You can call a Planned Parenthood right now and give a donation and say, I would like this donation to go towards specifically aborting a Black child, and they will take your money. It's a eugenics program. Do some research on Margaret Sanger, one of Hillary's close mentors, one of her role models, as she says. Do some research on Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger was working with the Klan, and Margaret Sanger was working with the elite leaders of the eugenics society. And they decided that one of the best ways to get rid of, to populate control people of color, was through abortion. So now abortion is being coined as reproductive freedom when it's actually convincing you to kill your own child so they won't have to. So just thought I would give you that fact, okay? Got any questions about that? Look up Margaret Sanger, the eugenics program, and the Negro Project, and you'll find all the information you need to know. House Bill 1584, we explained, was a throwback to Hitlerian population control efforts. Not to mention it was based on flawed policy premises regarding women on welfare, including any number of false assumptions about the link between income support and out-of-wedlock childbirths, which studies indicate is no real link at all. States with the most generous income support programs have lower rates of out-of-wedlock childbirth, while those with the highest rates of out-of-wedlock childbirth have the weakest social safety net programs. Seeing the sterilization bill as an obvious organizing opportunity for pro-choice forces, Annalise and I approached Louisiana Choice, the state affiliate for the National Abortion Rights Action League, the largest abortion rights group in the state, hoping to work together to defeat Duke's assault on the reproductive freedom of poor women. Despite several attempts to gain their interest or involve them in public events to discuss restrictions on abortion access and restrictions on the right to have children if so desired, the only reply from the NARAL folks was silence. They showed no interest in fighting the Duke bill. Well, I'm going to say it again. Why would they fight the Duke bill? It was another form of eugenics. Though their lack of apparent concern may have been due to overwork at trying to beat back the restrictions on abortion that were pending in the legislature, it's hard to avoid the thought that they were also making a decision influenced based on their own race and class biases. To the white and middle class led group, the reproductive freedom of poor women, especially of color, to have children in the face of a society that despises them, took a backseat to securing the rights of mostly middle class and white women who could afford abortions to terminate their pregnancies. In the end, House Bill 1584 was defeated, no thanks to the mainstream women's rights groups who ignored it. Of course they ignored it. Of course they ignored it. Because it was also a form of eugenics. In the end, yes. Sadly, the underlying logic of the proposal that poor women are too fertile and need to have their reproduction restricted either by force or bribe remains with us. Indeed, another state lawmaker in Louisiana proposed similar legislation in 2008, suggesting that while Duke may have been defeated in his attempts to shape the law, Dukeism remains a force to be reckoned with even 2 decades later. Listen to what he just said. There is a logic that says that poor women are too fertile and need to have their reproduction restricted either by force or by bribe. Here's another one. Or by making you believe that your child is not really a child in your womb. or by convincing you that murdering your child is really a freedom you're partaking in as opposed to murder. So if we can't convince you that what you're doing is a part of your freedoms, and if we can't bribe you into doing it, pay you into sterilization, pay you to go abort, then the third step is to force you. So I hope those of you who are listening, I hope you hear that. I hope you hear it. All right? So, especially African American women, if I can convince you it's a freedom and you go do it, then I don't have to bribe you. If I can bribe you to go do it, then I don't have to force you. But when I can't convince you it's a freedom and you understand the sanctity of life, and I can't bribe you to do it, then the third step is to force you to do it. I'm going to say it one more time for the people in the back. If I cannot convince you that murdering your child in your womb is a freedom, and if I cannot bribe you to do that, then the third step is to force you by law to do it. Because according to these people, according to the logic of some, poor women are too fertile and need to have their reproductions restricted. So who determines what poor is? And who's going to determine that in the future? What is considered poor? Because there will be a number attached to it. So if you make under a certain amount, you may be considered poor. And you may face a law one day that forces you to be sterilized because your income, according to law, says you can't afford children. And most certainly, if you're receiving financial assistance from the government or from the state, you most certainly are going to be categorized as too fertile and need to have your reproduction restricted. So think about that. We're continuing for our last section of reading today. All throughout the early to mid 1990s, New Orleans was known nationwide for its crime problem. And by then, it had already been notorious for years for its overzealous police force. The combination of these two facts made it difficult sometimes to know who the good guys were. For people of color, calling on police for help was a dicey proposition, mostly because they could never know whether help is what they'd receive as opposed to brutality and mistreatment. One night while we were living on Robert Street, one of the roommates, Daryl Barth, got to experience the brutality of the New Orleans Police Department up close and personal. Daryl, who remains to this day one of the most no BS people I've ever met, he says what's on his mind and could give a rat's butt if you like him or not, was and is a character possessing an almost encyclopedic knowledge about the city of New Orleans and especially its color divide, not only between black and white, but between Creoles, which he is, and everyone else. Daryl also is imbued with a classic punk rock mentality, not only because it's among the many styles of music he enjoys, but because it fits perfectly with his political sensibilities. He's always struck me as a combination of Jello Biafra, founding member of the Dead Kennedys, and Dr. Mad Vibe, lead singer of Fishbone, along with a little Bakunin and Huey Newton thrown in for good measure. On his way back from a party near the Riverbend area close to the top of Uptown, Daryl had the misfortune of walking while black on an evening when apparently someone else, also black, had mugged some white folks. Turning from Ferret Street onto Robert, and by this point only a few blocks from our house, Daryl found his path impeded by a police cruiser whose occupants hopped out and demanded that he tell them about jumping the white people. He replied that he had no idea what they were talking about and was just walking home. When Daryl proceeded to mumble something about the absurdity of the encounter, one of the officers grabbed him, prompting Daryl, who was fully aware of the reputation of the city's police and rightly concerned about being manhandled, to attempt to push the cop off of him. Enraged by the act of defiance, the officer then fulfilled his expected and typecast role by slugging Daryl in the mouth, splitting his lip in the process. The police then proceeded to shove Daryl into the car and drive to the corner of Farragut and Calhoun Streets, where another officer was speaking with a white female college student who had just been mugged. When the officers pulled Daryl from the car and asked if he was the one who had jumped her, the young woman insisted he was not. Unbowed, the police officers asked her 3 more times if she was sure, clearly disappointed by their bad collar and hoping to nail Daryl for the crime. She stood firm, however, and repeated that Daryl had not assaulted her. In truth, it would have been pretty hard for her to have forgotten Daryl had he been the one. After all, he was wearing a t-shirt that said "F-U" in bright red letters. Rather than release him, though, the police proceeded to throw him back in the car and began the drive downtown, where they explained he would be booked, presumably for the shove he'd administered to the cop who had sought to detain him for a crime he didn't commit. On the way downtown, as the officers lectured Daryl about how his family clearly hadn't raised him right, as evidenced by his lack of obeisance to the police, he proceeded to mention his family included police officers and that his uncle had been deputy superintendent at one point and chief detective. Unconvinced, they asked for his uncle's name, which he gladly provided, prompting the police to pull over, let Daryl know how lucky he was, and then put him out on the curb to walk back home. Such treatment would not be that which I would receive at the hands of the New Orleans police, however, and the difference is worth commenting upon. Around the same time, I too had encountered one of the city's finest. It had been early on a Tuesday afternoon. Nicole was in class at Tulane, and I had kept the car that morning while she was on campus so I could run errands. After returning home from lunch, I headed back out onto the street to get in the car and drive to Newcomb Hall to pick her up, at which point I saw that I had locked my keys in my car. Ticked off but not panicked, I had, after all, learned how to get into locked cars with a coat hanger when I was 16. I ran up the stairs, grabbed a wire hanger, headed back to the car to break in. Unfortunately, the 1988 Toyota Tercel is among the hardest cars on earth into which one may break, which is ironic considering how few people could possibly want to steal one. No matter my truly veteran efforts to open the door, I was having no luck even after 10 minutes. It was then, as I furiously was bending the hanger back and forth, trying desperately to jam it between the metal door frame and the rubber insulation around the window, that a police car pulled up. The officer hopped out and approached me. "What's going on here?" he asked, more curious than accusatory. "I locked myself out of my car and I've got to pick up my girlfriend in 5 minutes," I replied. I fully expected the officer to ask me for identification or some kind of proof that this was my car, which only goes to show how little I understood about the value of white skin in the eyes of law enforcement. "Well, I can tell you right now," he interjected, "the problem is you're doing that all wrong." "Excuse me?" I replied, not having expected to be told by a police officer that I lacked the necessary acumen to break into a car the right way. "Yeah, that's no way to break into a car," he insisted. "Here, let me show you how it's done." And with that, he went to his trunk, pulled out a Slim Jim, which is a long piece of flat metal that can pop a car door open by being shoved down behind the rubber seal around the bottom of the window until it meets an interior rod that controls the door function. Once it connects with the rod, a small hook on the end of the Slim Jim can pull up on the rod, opening the door. The officer proceeded to demonstrate the proper method for breaking into a car and seemed to take great glee at the opportunity to demonstrate his own technique for the maneuver. Sadly, he too would be unsuccessful. Still unconcerned about my identity or legitimate claim on the vehicle, he suggested that I should throw a rock through the window. When I told him my girlfriend would be pretty ticked at me for doing that, he said I could always tell her someone had broken into the car. Breaking the glass might even be fun, he insisted, making me think that perhaps he was wanting to do the honors himself. It is, of course, incomprehensible that had it been Daryl or any black person in his 20s who had locked himself out of his car and was trying to break in with a coat hanger, that anything about the encounter would have been the same. To think that an officer would have simply taken for granted that the vehicle belonged to the would-be black or brown break-in artist requires a level of naivety almost too stunning to fully comprehend. For whites, innocence was presumed until proven otherwise, while for blacks, the presumption of guilt was the default position. I've read for you today from White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Tim Wise. I don't even need to tell you the amount of cases, right, where this has proven to be the point, that the treatment of black and brown bodies in our communities oftentimes gets a different treatment than white people. I will say this. It has been said so many different times, but I will say this because I have officers in my family. I have close friends who serve as chiefs of cities. So I'm definitely not knocking the fact that they get a bad rap. But why do they get a bad rap? They get a bad rap because there are officers on forces, right, who really shouldn't even be there to begin with. They don't have patience for people. They don't have really a desire to serve the public. Some of them are there because they're on a power trip. Some of them are there as one gentleman coined, that they're race soldiers, that, you know, they have infiltrated as a part of white supremacist groups in order to use their power in an unlegal way. And so one of the things that Tim Wise points out here is oftentimes if you're in white skin, you are presumed innocent until proven guilty, which is actually supposed to be law for everyone, but oftentimes that does not happen. And so again, he's sharing his own experiences, the experiences of people who live with him in the same house, and the experience of how he was treated as a white person. As he said, the gentleman was showing him how to break in. And yeah. So there we go. All right, my Periscope just stopped on me all of a sudden. But as I'm closing, as I was giving you my closing thought here, he was showing just by his own personal experience, Tim Wise was showing by his own personal experience how easy it was for his whiteness to excuse what he was doing and get the police officers help, as opposed to the police officers' brutality. So that's one thing that he brought out in today's reading. Excuse me. He also brought out the fact that, you know, when he looks at the Jewish community, that the Jewish community seems to be, in his opinion, you know, only concerned about racial equality until it really starts to mess with Jewish ideas, right? As he was saying in his reading, that the moment you start pressing up against how the Jewish community felt about apartheid and how the Jewish community felt about the direction they want to go in, then he became a problem. And as his rabbi said, you know, Nothing that he was writing about or nothing that he was reporting on the Jewish support for the racists in South Africa was not true. But he felt like he should not have, as a Jew, been telling the truth about another Jewish person. So this concludes our reading for today. I encourage you to get the book if you would like to read along with us. And we are going to continue where we left off tomorrow. We'll be reading another section of this intersection between race, class, sexism, white supremacy, and white privilege. We'll continue this reading on tomorrow. I hope that you will come back and join us again, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Take care and God bless. Again, thank you all for your patience. I hope that you will come back and join us again tomorrow as we read from Tim Wise's book, White Like Me. Take care and God bless.